Good evening and welcome to this year's Carroll lecture, co-sponsored by the Georgia Tech Honors Program and our College of Sciences. I'm Greg Gumbel, Director of the Honors Program, and I'm always very pleased to see all sorts of people, students and faculty and staff and people from the larger Atlantic community come together for events like this. And since we are together in this space this evening, I'll ask you to join me in a very brief but important public ritual, and that is the silencing of the cell phones, Blackberries, or whatever the electronic noise maker you have on or about you. Thank you. The man for whom this lecture series is named, Les Karlovitz, would also be very happy to see everybody here tonight. Back when I came to Georgia Tech in the 1980s, Les Karlovitz was Dean of the College of Sciences and Liberal Studies, the old equivalent of our Arts and Sciences College. And Les Karlovitz was a dean with ideas, which can sometimes be a dangerous thing, deans with ideas, but not in Les's case. Les was a dean with good ideas. He was a very high standards, but he also liked to bring his faculty and students together for interdisciplinary events such as this one. Intellectual and social gatherings where historians heard what chemists were doing, and biologists listened to literary scholars, and we all got along and we all learned from each other. Les Karlovitz died in 1990, and I think it's very fitting that this lecture series be named in his memory. Every year it's a good opportunity for us to hear a good talk about science that speaks not just specifically to scientists, but to all of us. What I like to call accessible science, and that's why I'm very happy to have Joe Palca here tonight. I'm also very happy to thank a few good people for getting us all here tonight, because you have to know events like this don't just happen, and this one wouldn't have happened at all without the energy and organizational skills, and I think the sheer force of will of my colleague Monica Halka, who did essentially everything that needed doing. And what Monica didn't get done was done by Lindsay Anglin, an honors program student who works in our office, who is rather like radar on MASH. She has things finished before you can finish asking for them. And while Monica and Lindsay were doing all that they did to make this event happen, Nicole Leonard was performing her always remarkable miracles to keep the honors program and the honors program students all rolling. So thanks to them for all of that. And now to introduce Joe Palca, I'd like to call on Andy Smith, Georgia Tech Senior Vice Provost for Academic Affairs. Andy has been a long-time leader of the Georgia Tech faculty, someone who knew Les Karlovitz back in the day, and someone who I think, like Les Karlovitz, is able to take the broad view of our common intellectual enterprise. Andy's own intellectual enterprise is as Regents Professor of Psychology, a field of study that he shares with Joe Palca. And so I think there's no one better placed to introduce tonight's featured speaker, Andy Smith.
Dr. Nobel was right. Les Karlovitz really believed in making science accessible. And I can remember going to those lectures, really looking forward to them on every other Friday, when a scientist or historian or someone from the old COSOL would give a lecture, and then it would be followed by a discussion from everybody in the college. That was a pretty diverse college. That college turned into three colleges: the College of Computing, the Ivan Allen College, and the College of Sciences. So the accessibility of science was something he felt very strongly about. He used to encourage us to write op-ed pieces and to do things which really told people about how important science was to our culture. So our speaker today is, as Greg Nobel said, is a highly appropriate Les Karlovitz speaker. Joe Palca is the science correspondent for National Public Radio, but he also has served in the other journalistic media. He started his career in journalism as the science and medical reporter for the CBS affiliate in Washington, D.C., and then he worked for both Science Magazine and Nature Magazine as one of their correspondents. We know him best by his entertaining stories and really enterprising stories on genetic diagnosis, in testing, stem cell research, the 50th anniversary of the polio vaccine, neglected global diseases such as hookworm, and recently an article on Darwin's research with earthworms, celebrating the 200th anniversary of Darwin. He's won many, many awards. Just to name a few, the National Academy's Communication Award, the Science and Society Award of the National Association of Science Writers, the American Chemical Society James Grady James Stack Award for interpreting chemistry for the public, the American Association for the Advancement of Science Journalism Prize, and recently the Kahn Prize for Excellence in Reporting in Medical Science Reporting. We're pleased to have him here, and the title of his talk today is How to Explain the Universe in 2 minutes or Less. Jeff?
Hello. My name is Joe Palca. I am a reporter for National Public Radio. Whoops. Whoops. All right. Now we're in trouble. Typically, when I give a talk, I try to do it without notes in a relaxed manner, speaking off the cuff, as it were. It's a style that I've found works very well for me. But I have heard that using PowerPoint can help me communicate my ideas. Help me make my points more effectively. Help me engage my audience. So I decided to give it a try. What do you think so far? Am I making myself clear? Okay, that's it for the PowerPoint. I love doing that. Ever since, I mean, I didn't understand PowerPoint at all, and then my wife showed me how to use it. I said, oh, this is fun. What do people use it for? She said, they use it for giving boring talks. So I thought, well, I can do that. Anyway, it does serve a purpose in starting out my talk about explaining the universe in 2 minutes or less, because it's always interesting for me to come back to a room like this. So as you heard, I was a graduate student and I got my PhD, and I taught statistics to senior psychology majors who had put it off to the last semester before they graduated because it was the one thing they didn't want to take, you know, because they wanted to talk about clinical psych and developmental psych and, you know, behavioral psych and social psych. But they, you know, statistics was for other people, and they had to take it before they graduated. So you walk into the most hostile room you've ever been in. The only thing they could have done worse is make it at 7 in the morning or something like that. I really would have been cooked. But my attitude was, all right, I think statistics are kind of interesting. Okay, I admit there's a nerdly quality to that. But the fact is, I felt an obligation to come in and be interesting and entertaining and get people to pay attention. But the difference between what I did as a teacher and what I do now is that in those days, I was an essential roadblock, so to speak, between them and graduation. They could have complained and bitched and moaned all they liked, but they still had to pass the class in order to get out of the school. Whereas today, when I do a story for NPR, if I don't sound entertaining in the first minute or two, bang, gone. I mean, there's a lot of radio stations out there, and if it's not a radio station, I learned, by the way, that I had finally made it. You know, the first time I was at NPR, it was like, oh, you know, ever get the family around the radio, and we're all sitting there, and that's Joey, you know, and it's really exciting. And I knew I'd made it when my piece came on in the morning and my wife hit the snooze button. So I was already, my career was well underway at that point. But the fact is, I've got to, if I have something that I want to communicate, I've got to keep people from switching the dial, hitting the snooze button. I got to do something interesting. And so what I think of myself as, in some senses, almost primarily, is an entertainer. And I'm not as entertaining as some, because, you know, there's better entertainment. But I'm trying to be entertaining in a world of important stuff. And to that end, you know, I think it's a challenge every day because not every story that we have to tell is entertaining, but they can all be interesting. And that's where I start from. There really aren't any boring stories. I mean, people ask me, you know, what kind of classes I should take in college, you know, in liberal arts college or whatever. My attitude is if you have a choice, take the most interesting teacher. Because whatever teacher is going to engage you and teach you. I took Swedish history in college. Who knew, you know? It was a great class. In fact, well, that's another story. I'll tell you about it another time. Anyway, so basically, I mean, I don't want to say that I'm strictly an entertainer, but my union is the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. It doesn't say anything about journalism. And so I sort of feel a certain obligation to my audience to be interesting. The second thing I do is I inform people. And by that I mean, you know, this week, for example, and this is this is news. So how many people in this room heard that President Obama on Monday lifted restrictions that the Bush administration had placed on embryonic stem cell research? Yeah. So that's what we call news, right? It's a story because the President of the United States did it. In fact, I mean, if you think about it, the only thing surprising about it, I think this is why the media gets so silly. Everybody did the exact same story. Some of them did it better than others. But we're all saying the same thing. I don't quite understand how that's serving the public interest to have 50 reporters all writing down the same packaged speech from the president and then regurgitating it. What helps sometimes is to give it some perspective, which is what I like to try to do. But anyway, part of what I do is inform people about the news of the day. And in fact, if you ask me, the news was what took him so long, because this was one of his presidential campaign promises, and he could have done it the day he took office. But he didn't. I mean, nobody's really dug into it. It's probably not a very interesting story, but it's another story. Anyway, so that's what I do. I inform people, you know, about something that happened today. That's sort of the definition of news, something that affects your life. What I don't do, and this is where people get very itchy sometimes about my role as a science journalist, is I don't educate people. Because I remember what educating was like, and it's very different from what I do now. I mean, you see sitting down and writing out your course syllabus that says, I will be doing 3-minute classes at times I can't tell you in advance about a variety of different topics, and there won't be a test. It's not a great formula for educating the public. Educating is a commitment on both the part of the educator and the educatee to learn something and demonstrate some proficiency in it. And again, I don't know whether anybody, I mean, I'm a good communicator, allegedly. I win prizes and I get a paycheck, so that's good enough for me. But I don't know whether anybody understands what I talk about because they never tell me. Only thing they do is they write in and say, why did you use the split infinitive, you know, or you forgot to have your pronoun agree with your antecedent. Everyone is he or she, not there, right? So, you know, I don't hear anybody saying, oh, brilliant, I got it, and here's the proof. So it's a very different kind of activity. So I don't educate. It's too late. By the time you get to listen to NPR, it's too late to educate you. You should have done that before you turn on the radio. So basically, I'm stuck with informing people. But that's not to say that I can't be an adjunct to education. And I'm always very proud when somebody says, you know, you raised some interesting issues in your 3-minute piece, which we then subsequently spent 6 months discussing. Because that seems reasonable to me. I mean, that's the kind of intellectual requirement that some of the issues that I talk about really require. So the other thing I don't like to do, and this is what scientists sometimes seem to think part of my job is what we call in the media spinach journalism. I'm doing this story because it's good for you and you should listen to it. That's really a pain in the neck. I mean, and for a long time, people, like, I remember when I got started, when I got started in journalism, every other week someone would call me up and say, we need you to do a story about how smoking is bad for you. Because that was when, you know, the whole tide was shifting away. There was a time, you know, when we had to talk to both sides. Whenever you did a smoking story, you'd say, scientists say smoking is bad for you, and then you'd run over to the Tobacco Institute, which is a group of people from the tobacco companies, and you'd get the other side. And there was, believe it or not, there was the other side in the tobacco, where they'd say it wasn't proven, and you can't be sure, and blah, blah, blah. And then at some point, 10 or 15 years ago, they said, well, everybody knows cigarettes are bad for you, so if you smoked, it's your own damn fault, which was an interesting corner turning. I think it was like in one day, they changed arguments from they're not bad for you to everybody knows they're bad for you, and it's your own fault if you smoke them. But the story that people kept asking you to do was tell people smoking's bad for you. You go, what kind of a story is that? How am I going to tell anybody that? Everybody knows it's bad for you. That's not why they smoke. I mean, they're not smoking, oh, what can I do that's bad for me today? That had nothing to do with it, but they were always hawking us about doing, you know, something. It's important. Public doesn't understand. The public understood fine. It was much bigger issues than what the public did or didn't understand. So again, my feeling is when you're going to talk about just about anything, you have to make it interesting. And so actually the last smoking story I did, which was a few years ago, was about something that has to do, which I do think is interesting about anti-tobacco campaigns, and that is in the developing world. I went to Cambodia, and the reason we went there was the Global Tobacco Eradication Program was saying that tobacco companies are faced with declining sales in the developed world, and, you know, laws that are making it harder and harder for people to smoke, and taxes that are going up and up. You know, I don't know how they're going to fund health care if people really do stop smoking cigarettes. That's going to be a real problem with those tobacco taxes. But anyway, so it turns out that the developing world is the place you want to go because it's a whole market. And in fact, the message that smoking is bad for you hasn't come home to developing world yet. And the reason I know that is that Buddhist monks in Cambodia, monks, these are people who take a vow not to drink because it's taking a toxic substance into their bodies, smoke cigarettes. And in fact, when you go to your wat with your gift basket for the monk that you can buy at the local store outside the pagoda, the basket contains crackers and fruits and cookies and packages of cigarettes in this gift basket, because the monks like to smoke. And so we went over there to do this story, which I thought was a little bit, you know, counterintuitive, about how this guy was trying to use monks as social leaders, social psychology, sorry, missed one over, to change, you know, public behavior in terms of smoking. And they were trying to get smoke-free pagodas, which seemed interesting and a sort of a new take on the story, and that's why it intrigued me. So my feeling is you have to be interesting. Now, the next thing I want to talk a little bit about before I get to my examples and my explaining the world in 2 minutes is the fact that I want to talk about the definition of news. We talked a little bit about it in the Obama example. You know, the president says something today, that's news because he's the president, it happened today, and it's going to affect all our lives. That's kind of a straightforward definition of news. But the question is, oh, there's one other definition. News is something that happens to your editor. Because if your editor has an earache, or her editor, but more to my point, if your editor's child has an earache, suddenly you're doing stories about otitis media, because that's what everybody wants to know more about. But science news is a completely different kettle of fish. And here I'd like to get a little interactive, if I can, for a moment and ask you to think about the following question. So I am, with all modesty, one of the top science writers in the United States of America, right? What story could I have failed to cover last year in science journalism and wouldn't have been able to show my face? I mean, it's so important that people would have laughed and pointed and said, Joe Palca missed that story. So what science news story do you think was so important that I absolutely had to be covered, couldn't have been ignored, totally wrong? Yeah?
The turning on of the LHC.
That's a good one. Why?
Because they spent billions of dollars.
Right. But the day they turn it on, they don't, you know, that's another one of those great things. I agree with you. That's probably, anybody else have a candidate? I want to come back to that one. Anybody else have a candidate? Yeah. Well, yeah, no. No. I could have missed that story. All right, so, but I would say turning on LHC, but again, the point there is they'd already been playing with it and running it and testing it and blah, blah, blah. The turning on was just an arbitrary day. They said, we'll invite the media in on Tuesday. It had been on and off many times up until then. We create news in science. We manufacture moments. I would say, actually, that a news story would be the landing of the Phoenix on the North Polar region of Mars, because that happened in one day. It's more of an engineering feat. It's not really science, because they didn't get any science out of it for a while. They may never. But at least it's something that happened that day. But my point is, there's virtually nothing. It's pathetic. It's pathetic. There is no news. John is over there writing like press releases like crazy, and I keep thinking, well, but I could do that next week or the previous week, and the reason we do it as news is it appears in a journal. Well, my God, the researcher's probably bored with the story by the time it appears in a journal. He's off working on, or she's off working on something else by then. So we've tried to cram this ridiculous world of science. I mean, not ridiculous. It's the ridiculous world of news. We've tried to cram science into that. And if you guys have learned anything in the time you've been here, you know that it's a process. It doesn't end the day you write the paper or send in the grant application or even have the result, because the result's going to be tested and vetted and turned around and thought about. So the idea that, you know, people stand up and say, well, what do scientists think today? You know, it's a continuum. And I think that's what confuses people, because one day caffeine is bad for you and the next day it's good for you, and one day red wine is bad for you and the next day it's good for you. And the reason is because it's changing, because the picture is changing. And so what I've begun to say, and I love this example. People at the end of the year, this is what happens in news. At the end of the year, people say to you, what are the big science stories of the year? We want to do a recap. And I say, I don't know. Ask me in 8 years. And here's why I say that. So in 1998, Andy Fire and Craig Mello wrote a paper called The Potent and Specific Genetic Interference by Double-Stranded RNA in Caenorhabditis elegans, Nature. Now, Nature is a publication that I get an advance copy of every week, so I know everything that's in the journal in advance so that I can select the top story from Nature and tell an anxiously awaiting public what the most important science news is for that week. That's a game that we in the journals play to make news. We embargoed the journal until a specific day, and then we all do it on the same day, and it's like a miracle that everybody came to the same thing in the newspaper on the same day. It's not a miracle. It's because the journals orchestrate it to be that way. So here's a paper in 1998 about RNA interference. Has anybody ever heard of that? In 2006, this paper was cited by the Nobel Prize Committee in its press release as being the example of the first work on RNA interference for which Andy Fire and Craig Mello won the Nobel Prize 8 years later. Now, usually it takes a lot longer to appreciate the importance of something in science, or frequently it does. But this was 8 years. And so the question is, me, as a top science journalist, even back in 1998, what did I do with this paper when I saw it in Nature and, you know, my early press release? Nothing. And you know how many papers, you know how many news organizations covered this paper in 1998? Not one. There was no press coverage of this paper. Do you know how many news organizations covered the Nobel Prize in 2006? Several thousand. Because it works in hindsight. Ask me in 5 years what's important, and then I'll let you know. It's just too hard to know. And so what I've done is I've said, okay, I don't give this lecture, I don't give this talk when I'm talking to news editors, because I would have talked myself out of a job. What I say to myself anyway is, once you've made that decision, once you realize that you can't miss a story because there's really nothing to miss. I mean, I missed this by 8 years and nobody complained. Right? There's nothing to miss. And what it means is there's a zillion interesting things to do. There's just a zillion. There's hundreds of interesting articles every day coming out in the journals and press releases and periodicals and scientists that you meet in the street everywhere. There's a ton of interesting science stories, and so I get to pick and choose. The one caveat is the news shows are always full and they're crowded and they don't have a lot of time. So the first question anybody ever asks you if you're going to say, I have a story about this, is how long is it? And famously, when I worked at Nature, they took this to an extreme. The news editor was actually the editor-in-chief's secretary, and her job was basically pasting all the pages. And one time when I was acting as the news editor and there was a piece from India, and I said to her, she told me this piece had come in, and I said, what's it about? And she said, it's about 8 inches, which was how much text it was. So when people now ask me, what's my story about? I say it's about 2.5 minutes. And they say, no, we want to know what's the topic. So, but a lot of times what they really mean is, what's the length? And so I've sort of taken the approach that if you can do it short, you can probably squeeze it into any show, because they're always got these 2-minute holes that they want to put stuff in. So I've made a career out of doing shorter pieces, and some of them are completely ridiculous. And maybe now is, well, okay. Before we get to the first one, I just want to talk to you about my final didactic point of the evening, which is you really can tell any story in a sentence or two. I mean, when people say, how long is it? My question really is, how much time have you got? Because as I said, I can talk for a semester, or I can talk for 1.5 minutes. You let me know how much time I got, and I'll try and accommodate you. The problem is, for most people in switching from science to journalism, is they have a very hard time boiling down the essence of what they're talking about. And sometimes, I believe if you can't say what you're talking about in one sentence, you're not really sure what you're talking about. Now, you sometimes have to think, and you certainly have to leave a lot of stuff out, but I believe that you can describe, and I was going to play another game with you, but we'll do that later if there's time, of just give me a topic that you need me to describe in one sentence, and I will. And we'll see if you can come up with one. But I came up with one that I didn't do, because I didn't think I could. And I want to read to you from the New York Times, because I don't think they succeeded either. But this was a story from March 20th, 2007, The Scientific Promise of Perfect Symmetry, written by a terrific guy, Kenneth Chang. And here's how the story begins. It's one of the most symmetrical mathematical structures in the universe. It may underlie the theory of everything that physicists seek to describe the universe. 18 mathematicians spent 4 years and 77 hours of supercomputer computation to describe this structure, with the results unveiled yesterday at a talk at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Okay, that's 4 sentences. We don't know what the hell he's talking about yet. But it's still not easy to describe the description, at least not in words. Okay, so now he's saying, I can't describe it. And then the first quote is, it's pretty abstract, conceded Jeff Abrams, a professor of mathematics at the University of Maryland who led the project. And if we have time, I'll tell you, I had dinner with him. He tried to convince me to do this story. I don't know what you're talking about. For mathematicians and physicists, symmetry can provide crucial insights into a problem. A 19th century Norwegian mathematician, Sophus Lie, wrote down what are known as Lie groups, sets of continuous transformations. Okay, I'm getting a little lost here, meaning the changes could be a little or a lot. Okay, I get that's continuous, but what's a transformation? That leave an object unchanged in appearance. All right, I'm getting closer. For example, rotate a sphere any distance around any axis, and the sphere looks exactly the same. Okay, so we're talking about some kind of symmetry in 3 dimensions. Later, mathematicians found 5 exceptions to the 4 classes of Lie groups that Lie knew. Anyway, I'm completely dead here. And so basically my answer is, when you have to give a 1-sentence explanation and you don't know what you're talking about, punt. It's not possible. So I just wanted to prove, so people ask me what's the hardest subject to do, and I picked mathematics you could never do. But I figured I would show you that it's possible to do a mathematics story in less than 2 minutes. So here we go. Start of something big. They always have good musical jokes if you know to listen. Anyway, so, you know, I mean, so I just thought I thought it was fun. And actually, in looking up stories that I could play for this, I got interested to see what the current world record is for the largest. I have two mistakes in that story. One is it's Mersenne, not Marsen. I was mispronouncing it. And the second is Mersenne was a 16th century French monk who had made a prediction about these prime numbers, which turned out to be wrong, but he got to keep the name, or they got. And the second thing is there is a mathematical formula for finding them. That's how they find them. I mean, they don't actually divide by 2 and then 3 and then 5 and then, you know, because that would take forever. There is a formula. It turns out the mathematically challenging part of this is actually taking the number, getting it into the CPU, doing something to it, and taking it out again. Because right now, the largest Mersenne prime is 128 million digits long. And to do this mathematical search, you have to multiply two 128 million digit long numbers against one another. And that apparently is computationally very challenging. I haven't tried it. We could do that later if you want. But the thing of it is, and this is the, so I got interested in this, and it turns out there's a ton of interesting things about the people who search for them, the types of computers. There's now something, here, I'm getting you in on the next big NPR breakthrough in science. There's a program called GIMPS, the Great Internet Mersenne Prime Search Program. And you can download something to your PC or Mac that will run a Mersenne prime when your computer isn't doing anything else. So why do you want to find one of these? Well, the guy who was looking, he said, I take my family to see the Hope Diamond in Washington, D.C., which is the largest diamond, and people come around the case and they all look at it, and nobody says, what does it matter, it's the biggest one. People just like to look at it. So I kind of get that. But I think it also gives you a little window into the mind of people who like to study numbers. Anyway, maybe that's enough of that. The other thing I wanted to play for you, this perchlorate, is to show that so what did I do there? It was about 2 minutes and 12 seconds, I think. But the point is, you can pack a lot. I mean, I explained to people what a prime was, a little bit about how they find them, a little bit about this strange class of primes. 2 minutes. So here's one other, and just to prove it doesn't have to be completely nonsense, it can actually be on the news. This was a piece of news. Oh, Joe Palca, NPR News. I cut it off in the tape recording. Anyway, that was a minute 45. And actually, I thought, geez, I think you got the whole story. I don't think I could have told a lot more, and I probably could have cut some stuff out. But that's my point. I think once if the message is fairly clear, they found perchlorate on Mars, and they don't know what it means. I think that's probably about all you can do. Now, I'm at a bit of an interesting turning point because I kind of liked your reaction to some of the stuff that was in that other piece when you found what these guys were saying amusing. And one of the funniest pieces I've ever done was longer than 2 minutes, but I think you guys would like it because of your engineering backgrounds. So I'm going to play this for you. It's also mathematics because this is we're honoring a mathematician, right? All right. So this piece is one of the most deceitful, unfair, mean things I've ever. Anyway, so I guess, just thinking back, I really think, I have been this week on the news, commenting on Obama and commenting on this, that, and the other thing, but I really think that my role as a science journalist is honestly just to talk about science and the interesting things that are there, and I think it's to talk about it in a straightforward, clear manner, and I think, when you think about explaining what you're doing to people, if you can remember, first of all, that you think it's interesting or you wouldn't be doing it, or I hope you think it's interesting or you wouldn't be doing it, and that you're allowed to use any stratagem you need to get other people interested because they ought to be, you'll become a good communicator. So with that, I thank you, and I'm happy to play other stories or answer questions.
Yeah, so I listen to NPR periodically. Once I almost switched off NPR and never turned it back on again because there was a Scotsman talking, a person who wrote a book called Swing How Swing. And he said 3 or 4 words and his voice faded out, at which point someone did a voiceover to translate
Yeah.
Scottish closer to the English into American English. But the most insulting thing, it was actually a woman they used for the voiceover as well. But anyway, I managed to get through that. I still came along this evening. One thing I always find in your articles, you talk generically about scientists or engineers. And when I talk in the class, sometimes I have to point out and say, you're the scientist or you're the engineer. Why do you use that term? Because it would be better to, in some sense, say that this subsection of science, such as biologists or that, consider that. Why do you keep it generic? Do you need a voiceover?
Yeah, I don't. Although the best voiceover I ever heard, I have a friend from Kirkcaldy, and so my ear got tuned, so I understand it pretty well. Although the best voiceover was they had these 2-year-olds playing, and they voiced over the 2-year-old babble. I want that toy. No, you can't have it. It's mine. I want that toy. I want that toy now. I think that's a great point, because I think that especially, to me, I really like the Mars stories. I've been doing a lot of them, but they never say to you, what's the new engineering from Mars? They always say, what's the new science from Mars? The engineering is they got the damn thing up there and down there, and it works, and it scoops. And the science is pretty minimal. The real science is coming from the orbiting spacecraft. So, I take your point. And the way to make a change in the media, by the way, is to get somebody who's stuck because they're on stage and you're in the audience, or some other situation where they're equally stuck, and give them your point of view. And maybe they'll think about it and make a change. Yeah?
When are journalists going to stop giving religious authorities so much time on the air when you're doing a story on evolution?
Well, I think we got to go now. It's been nice. I think the answer is when science journalists rule the world. Is truthfully the answer. We live in a pluralistic society. We live in a society where we pledge allegiance to the flag and to one nation under God. God seems to creep into things in times when you would think, where did that come from? It's part of what our society is. I actually really enjoyed, I shouldn't have done that. I'm not used to wearing a lav mic. I really enjoyed a statement at the end of one of my Darwin pieces, which said, I was talking about, I interviewed these British clerics who were saying, we don't have a problem with Darwin. That's a whole different world. It's, we talk about the spiritual world and they talk about the natural world, and, so be it. And I came to this country and talked about how it's still somewhat controversial, and it is. I'm just sorry it is. I wish that more than 42%, well, I wish fewer than 42% of the people in this country believe that humans were placed on the earth in the exact form that they are in today, because I think there's a better natural explanation. The problem is that it's not a scientific debate. And at the end of the story that I did, I said, scientists aren't debating this. They're not debates in science about evolution. It's a cultural debate. And I'm not in charge of the culture wars. So, yeah.
How many people went online and learned more about the spinning egg?
Well, I don't think we actually. I think the website was down for most of 2002. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, we in the media generally, and we at NPR in particular, like, we're terrified about what the web means for radio. We have, whatever, 32 million or 26 million weekly listeners, and a good story will get a few thousand hits, or 10,000 or 20,000. We're kind of going, wait a minute. Let's look at the numbers here. Average quarter hour for morning edition, 1.5 million. Number of hits on our website, 10,000. Somebody gets 100 comments on a story and they're going, woohoo! You think, wait a minute, you guys don't know scaling very well, because those are just different numbers, but we're all pushing our resources into web. So I don't know is the answer. The metrics are all bad, but there are many, many fewer go online than hear it. Many, many fewer, yeah.
Could you comment or share your thoughts about American scientific literacy and what it might imply in terms of what we need to do for science education?
Well, I think it's, well, I mean, I'm sure it's not nearly where it ought to be. That's for sure. I think my job is to, again, point out that science is interesting, and sometimes I'm so interested that it seems like I'm mocking it, and I'm really not. I'm just delighted by it. I mean, the spinning egg is really an interesting problem. It's just, who would have thought? But I think, and this goes back to what I started about education, I think it all starts in grade school. And I think learning to honor science and learning about it is important is where it should start. And I mean, it's, come into this room, what are people going to think? Of course people are going to think science is important. It's got to be in places where it's not held in such high esteem, and especially academic institutions where it's not held in such high esteem. That's my opinion. As I said, by the time people switch on NPR, they're lost. I mean, or at least I can't help. I can only get them interested. Or maybe I can get the kids interested and their parents will. I don't know. I'm troubled by it, and I don't have a good answer. And it's too hard to do what you do, so I be on the radio. Monica? Yes? Oh, sorry.
How long does it take you to write and prepare for a 2-minute radio segment?
Well, what did they say? It would have been a shorter piece if I'd had more time. A lot of times it's shaping it and honing it and filtering stuff out. I mean, I can do a 2-minute piece in as fast as my fingers can type if I know what the topic is, and that's not very fast. And or it can take 3 or 4 days of calling and thinking and writing and learning, and then but I tend. I mean, again, every story begins. It's like. Do you guys remember? You're probably closer to this. You know when they used to say, "Here's a test, and you've got 40 minutes for the test, and you won't be able to finish." So you have to decide how best to structure your time, because your grade is going to be based on how well you do in the 40 minutes. Everybody's got 40 minutes. Nobody's going to finish. You've got to do your best in that time. That's what my job is every day. But I always piss me off, because the teachers always say, people would get to the 40 minutes and say, okay, pencils down, and people go, no, I'm not done. And the guy would say, okay, you can have another 10 minutes. And I've strategized this thing to be done by 40 minutes. I don't have 10 more minutes to do. I'm done. And so that's why I think I got the right job, because they never move, all things considered, from 4 to 4:15, because I'm not done yet. And so it's a good discipline to have. But the answer is, I think the fastest, I wrote a 2.5-minute obit for Glenn Seaborg, who I learned died at 20 minutes past 4, and it was on the air before All Things Considered went off at 6. So, again, how much facts did I have? there's a lot of stuff to draw on about Glenn Seaborg, so it wasn't so hard, but it varies. I'm pretty fast. Richard Harris, my colleague Richard Harris, the fastest in the world. I aspire to that. Well, let's let somebody else. Oh, same people. All right, you can have one more.
Who would you say are some of the best popular writers on science?
I think you had. You had Lehrer. He was here. He's good. In social science, Erica Good at the New York Times. She doesn't write very much now, but she's great. I think this guy I liked him was Sean Carroll, the guy who writes about Evo-Devo, evolution and development. It's very good. So I go there. I think those guys are good. Did you have another question? Yeah, go ahead.
How do you think scientists are doing in, I guess, communicating the concept of climate change to policymakers?
Oh, I think they're doing fine. I'm at a loss. I know that people have been railing about, oh, they don't get it, they don't get it. They got it. The last administration got it. They just went, ooh! It was they didn't want to hear. I don't think that scientists have failed utterly. I just think that people came in with a point of view. And I mean, if you're gonna let James Imhoff have a place to stand and talk about climate change, then you're in trouble. I mean, they got it. They just didn't want to hear it. I think that's what happened. And I don't understand it. You know, I mean, when people got all, for the last few years, people have been very agitated with the media that they haven't been telling the public about climate change. I don't think that's true. I think everybody knows about climate change. I think what is the truth, and nobody really likes to talk about it, it's not clear what we can do about it. I mean, we can do something. We can do something. Whether we can fix it, I don't think is clear. But as I was actually, this is one of those, you have these Washington moments. This is something that happens in Washington, nowhere else. So my 12-year-old son's soccer coach is now the chief of staff for the vice president. Whoa. And my other son's baseball coach a few years ago was the head of the Domestic Policy Council under Clinton. Whoa, you know, these are people like, okay, get Putin on the line, you know. So it's a very weird town to live in. But over the weekend, I was having dinner with a woman who's just joined the Obama administration as the chief lawyer for climate change at the Environmental Protection Agency. So she's one of the people that's going to try to reverse all the policies that were put in place over the last 8 years. And we got into this discussion about, you know, whether we could do it. She got agitated with me, I think, a little bit, because I was saying, well, you know, what's enough? What can we do? And she said, it doesn't matter. And she made a great point. She said, look, so maybe we won't fix it, or maybe it doesn't need to be fixed, and all we're going to be stuck with is cleaner air and cleaner water and a longer run-out time on the fossil fuels in the world. That's not so bad. I thought, yeah, okay, I'll take your point. Anyway, maybe you want to go and, okay, one more, yes. Now, since we're on the climate change topic.
Yeah, it's on the climate change. So some comments that I was wanting your feedback on. You told this great narrative about the tobacco coverage and making a parallel with the climate change coverage. It seems we've gone from nothing's happening to it's happening, but there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah.
Part A. Part B is that the fair and balanced media coverage has also played an important role in public information or misinformation. So how do you view the role of science journalism right now in shaping the dialogue?
Well, I mean, for what it's worth, I think that, you know, in one sense, NPR is at the lunatic fringe of the media, because I think we've been doing a good job of saying what it is all along. I think you're absolutely right, and I'm glad you saw the parallel between the smoking, you know, and the turning the corner. I think the role now is a little bit to get away from the Chicken Little reporting and try to get into the here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's what we can think about doing. Because I think, from where I sat, the recalcitrance of the former administration to even acknowledge the problem made the clamor from the scientific community even louder than it had to be. And there is a reasonable set of arguments and discussions that need to take place, and we can admit where there's uncertainty without saying, you're wrong. Uncertainty, that's why this was this whole evolution thing. If you find some thing that doesn't behave like Darwin predicted, or some genetic trait that isn't conserved or seems to be going in the wrong way even though it's favorable, that doesn't mean Darwin's wrong. That means you don't fully understand the problem. It could mean Darwin's wrong, but the first thing you say is, oh, well, everything's wrong. No, it means, what don't you understand? And so I think that's where we kind of got to. People said, oh, well, they're not certain about, how fast it's going up, and one number says one, and so we don't know for sure. No, we know for sure. What we don't know is the textured for sure. And then our role in the media becomes what I think the media's role is supposed to be, is to say what's the best knowledge now and what's missing and what can we learn, I hope. Anyway.
The talk we just heard, Joe Palca's promised to do two more things, at least two more things. One, tomorrow, he'll meet with students at 11 o'clock in the Honors Program office to have more informal questions. And so we welcome all students to come there. But tonight, right now, he will sign copies of this flyer for you. if you promise not to post it on eBay tomorrow.
Right.
So, but right now I want to thank Joe Palca for a wonderful talk, a wonderful evening, and some wonderful insights into NPR. Thank you very much, Joe. This is the autograph now.
Yeah.